Um, Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our virtual lecture series entitled Discover Ukraine, History, Culture and its People. This event has been organized by the BASIS Study Group for Minority History. We would like to thank our partners, URIS, Ukrainian Research in Switzerland Initiative, Universidad Internacional de Cuernavaca, Oriente Medio News, Bnei Chile, and Círculo Israelita de Santiago for bringing this course to Latin America. We would like to remind you that this is a fundraising event for Razum for Ukraine Emergency Response, and you can find the link to donate in the chat. My name is Elena Palko, and I am a Liverpool Early Career Fellow at Birkbeck College in London and a co-convener of the Study Group for Minority History. Today, we have our fourth lecture, and this lecture, I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Jan Rybak. So Jan Rybak is an early career fellow at Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism in London. He received his PhD from the European University Institute in Florence and has held fellowships at the University of York, New York University, as well as Kolín and the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, amongst other places. His first book, Everyday Zionism in East Central Europe, Nation Building in War and Revolution 1914-1920 was published by Oxford University Press in 2021. He is currently working on a new project on Jewish armed self-organizations and self-defense against persecutions and violence in Eastern Europe, focusing a lot on Jewish militant self-defense against the pogroms during Ukraine's civil war that followed the 1917 Russian Revolution. Today, he will be given an introduction on Jewish life and politics and to violence and destructions in Ukraine from the late 19th century to the Holocaust. So his presentation is entitled Destruction, Revolution and Autonomy, Jewish History in Ukraine from the late 19th century to the Holocaust. Thank you, Jan, for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Olena, for the very kind introduction. Thank you, everybody who is involved in the organization of this lecture series, which has already been incredibly interesting and inspiring and fascinating lectures that we had so far. I hope that I can contribute a little bit on the aspect of Jewish history in Ukraine or in the Ukrainian lands with this very broad, I have to say, overview over quite a long period. Let me start by sharing my slides here. I hope you can see that. Can somebody do any sign? Yeah, okay.
Yes, perfect.
So I will be speaking about the Jewish experience in Ukraine, or in the regions that are today part of Ukraine, from the late 19th century through the civil war and the pogroms of the early 19th century and the early 20th century, the interwar communist period, and the Holocaust. So legend has it that since the exile of the 10 northern tribes in the 8th century, or the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, Jews migrated to and lived in the lands that are today part of Ukraine. Myth or not, excavations of early Greek colonies on the Crimean Peninsula point to Jewish presence there since antiquity. Since then, we have continuous evidence of Jewish presence, of Jewish life, of Jewish culture, religious practices, encounters with their surroundings, and so on, which all of that would require a lecture series of its own. In essence, and this is what I want to emphasize, no period and no aspect in the history of Ukraine or the lands that are today part of Ukraine can be written without Jewish history. Jewish history is Ukrainian history and vice versa. In much of the memory of Ukraine already before the Holocaust, the Ukrainian lands were associated with persecution and destruction. This is true since the Cossack uprising of Khmelnytsky in the mid-17th century, during which an estimated half of Ukraine's Jewish population was murdered. And even more, of course, with the pogroms of the late 19th and early 20th century, and especially, of course, with the Holocaust. And while much of my lecture will have to look at this violence and trauma, I will also be speaking about economic and social life, about culture, religion, politics, and self-assertion. It was such an integral part of Jewish life in this region during a period of radical change. Between revolution and tradition, between secularism and religion, nationalism and universalism, and every conceivable combination of them, the lands that are today part of Ukraine, and not least in the period that I'm talking about, were home to and shaped some of the most important figures in modern Jewish and European history and world history. And each of them would require their own lecture series, or at least part of that. Leon Trotsky, for example, who would later lead the Red Army during the Civil War, was a native to Yanovka, or Pereslavka, as it is called in central Ukraine. Israel's first and so far only female prime minister, Golda Meir, was born in Kiev. And the ideas of the father of the Zionist right, Zev Jabotinsky, were profoundly shaped in his hometown of Odessa, as was the writer Isaac Babel. Bila Tserkva, here near Kiev, was the home of Josef Jossele Rosenblatt, the greatest cantor of his time. Especially the west of the country shaped some of the most important legal minds, both religious and secular. Rabbi Sholem Mordechai Shvadron wrote some of the most widely studied works on practical halakha, Jewish religious law, and became known of the Gaon of Bereshnai. Today's University of Lviv counts two of the 20th century's most brilliant scholars of international law as its alumni, Herr Schlauterbach and Raphael Lemkin, the latter shaping our contemporary understanding of the crime of genocide. They and millions more spoke, wrote, and thought in a plurality of languages, and many of them, if they were asked, may not have identified as Ukrainian Jews necessarily. But they all are, in different ways, part of the complex and multifaceted Jewish history of Ukraine. So let me start with some background. The vast majority of Jews in this region originally lived in the lands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Here you see that the greatest extension in the 17th century, covering much of Western and Central Ukraine. This background to a large extent informed the Jewish settlement patterns in Ukraine. As you can see here, on this map, showing Jewish presence in the turn of the century at the 19th to the 20th century, projected on today's map of Ukraine, there is a strong concentration in the western center of the country. And the further we go to the east, the smaller the Jewish communities become. So while in Lviv, over a quarter of the population was Jewish at the time, it was around 13% in Kiev and only 5.7% in Kharkiv, where the community had only been established in the 1850s. Now, the three partitions of these lands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth between the great imperial powers towards the end of the 18th century brought the Jews there under two quite different sets of regimes. To the west, Galicia, and also Bukovina, but I'm mainly going to look at East Galicia here, came under the rule of Habsburg Austria. The east, most of what is today Ukraine, under the rule of the Russian Tsar. Those who found themselves in the Russian Empire were confined to a specific area termed the Pale of Settlement, which covered most of Ukraine, as well as Belarus and parts of the Baltics and Poland. You can see that here, and you can see also estimates of the Jewish population in these regions. Now, the borders and the rules that applied there somewhat changed over time. But for the most of the time, most Jews were not allowed to reside anywhere else in the empire but in the Pale. If they wanted to move somewhere else, they needed special permissions, which was rarely granted. Following the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881 and the anti-Jewish pogroms that ensued, we will get back to them, laws further restricted Jewish settlement outside of towns and cities, and quotas were introduced that limited Jews' access to high schools and universities. All this had to be seen in the wider context of the extremely repressive nature of the Tsarist regime overall, and all of it contributing to a highly precarious situation for the Jews in the region. In contrast, those who find themselves under Habsburg rule experienced a gradual process of first tolerance and then emancipation, which from 1867 guaranteed all male citizens, regardless of religion or ethnicity, equal rights. This didn't mean that there was no discrimination or anti-Semitism in the Habsburg Empire, far from it. But the overall legal conditions and possibilities that came with them were considerably better. But despite these differences, we can also see some similarities. The first being demographic. In both regions, the Jewish population increased between 5- and 6-fold through the 19th century. This substantial growth, which was greater than amongst the Christian population, meant an enormous pressure on communities, economies, and educational institutions, and so on. Especially in the Pale, where both upward mobility and migration was already considerably curtailed, this contributed to a substantial economic and social crisis and to the impoverishment of large segments of the Jewish population, and subsequently also large-scale emigration of Ukrainian Jews to the West, and mainly to the Americas. Of an estimated 2 million European Jews who left the old continent between 1881 and 1914, a considerable part came from Ukraine. In the Habsburg Empire, where there was also indeed large-scale emigration to the Americas, and internal migration to the imperial center was also a key factor, which meant that towards the outbreak of the First World War, Vienna, so far from Ukraine, in fact, was home to one of the biggest Galician Jewish communities, with its own distinct microcosm of culture, religious practice, and political activism. In both East Galicia and in the Pale of Settlement, Jews lived predominantly in urban centers. Oh, we have that. Yeah. And in small market towns, the Städte. Indeed, at the turn of the century, 80% of Jews in Ukraine lived in cities and towns, compared to only 6% of Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians. That is. The larger cities were typically divided quite evenly between Jews, Russians, and Ukrainians, while in East Galicia, Poles and Jews were usually the numerically dominant groups in the cities and towns. The special geographic distribution of Jews correlated with their economic status. One aspect that is of key importance here is that in much of Central and Eastern Ukraine, Central and Eastern Europe, and this goes beyond Ukraine, class or economic role and ethnicity were overlapping and mutually reinforcing factors. The vast majority of Ukrainians in both regions were peasants, whereas Jews primarily worked as artisans or small merchants or in industry in market towns and cities. Jews had also a significant presence in the liberal professions, that is, as lawyers, doctors, and so on. Many more, and especially in Ukraine for that matter, often didn't follow a fixed profession. They were often described as Luftmenschen, people living from thin air, a term describing their poverty in their, like having no fixed income, having no solid status in society, and being extremely poor. Now, the class and the economic difference to others is important, because it meant that Jewish Ukrainian encounters in particular were not only encounters between people of different ethnicities and religions, but also in many cases of people with different economic and societal roles. This was one, albeit not the only, reason for why grievances over real or imagined economic injustices, for example, rising prices of manufactured goods, often found their expression in complaints about the Jews, or even in outright anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish violence. And we will have to get back to that. It is this simultaneous remoteness and proximity that shaped so much the relations between Jews and their non-Jewish neighbors in these lands. The vast majority of Jews spoke Yiddish. In Tsarist Ukraine, we know that according to the 1897 imperial census, which has been cited before in this lecture series, 97% of Jews defined by religion spoke Yiddish, with only 1.2% speaking Russian and a tiny minority of 0.05% Ukrainian as their first language. We don't have such exact figures for East Galicia, and we would fall, I believe, into a trap that the makers of the census have laid out for us if we took all these figures at face value. The census is indeed intended to document the population, but at the same time also to shape it. This starts with what is asked for and what possible answers were and who conducted the census. In Galicia, for example, the census asked for the language of everyday use, but allowed only for one answer, and crucially did not give the option to answer Yiddish. This was in turn a tool by the local administration, heavily influenced by Polish nationalists, to shape the outcome of the census by artificially incorporating the Jews amongst them as Polish speakers, thereby claiming demographic hegemony over the Ukrainians in the region. If we accepted this linguistic separation, if we would go further and believe that linguistic difference would also mean social difference or national difference, this would point towards an isolation from the non-Jewish population. But while in much of day-to-day life, Jews and non-Jews went their separate ways, this should not obfuscate the fact that people knew each other, indeed depended on each other, and that there was considerable exchange. Especially in the urban centers, many Jews were most likely multilingual. And we can see this in the language itself, this exchange. The regional Yiddish dialect includes quite a few examples of Ukrainian terms and grammatical structures, or terms at least. We can also see this in regional cuisine, where many dishes, of course with the omission of pork, but while remaining their names, have made it from Christian Ukrainian or the local Slavic non-Jewish kitchen table to the Jewish kitchen table, and vice versa. Now, historian Henry Abramson speaks of three basic truisms about Jewish society in Ukraine. That it was a religious, gendered, and changing society. Much of day-to-day life, especially in the shtetl, in the small towns, was defined by the observance of Jewish law, regulating even seemingly the most mundane daily tasks and structuring the day. For men, the day was structured according to the times of prayer and often study. Women, not being obliged to attend the fixed prayers, would usually not attend them. However, as the space for much of the religious practice was the home, women played a key role for the observance of religious law and customs. Contact between men and women was strongly limited, unless amongst blood relatives, of course, and especially women were expected to marry relatively young. And I would like to emphasize here the transformative experience of especially young people when they left the shtetl to the city or to emigrate abroad, or when they joined modern movements, especially socialists or other revolutionaries. Especially for young women, activity in one of those many socialist revolutionary movements that emerged in the late 19th century was not only a part of the struggle for workers' liberation or human freedom, but was also part of their own emancipation. Now, returning to the religious aspect, Ukraine was the heartland of Hasidism. Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, the Baal Shem Tov or Besht, had lived in Western Ukraine, as had obviously his great-grandson, Rabbi Nachman of Brestov, whose home in Uman in central Ukraine remains one of the most important Jewish religious pilgrimage sites. Hasidism established the tzaddik as a charismatic leading figure who acted as an intermediary between the divine and his own followers. The spiritual and social innovation since the early 19th century, in particular, attracted huge followings. While the Russian authorities in particular tried to restrain the activities of the tzaddikim, Hasidism proved to be extraordinarily popular in our region, winning the allegiance of the majority of traditional Jews. They centered chiefly on a number of dynasties, rabbinical dynasties, as those in Belz, Bratslav, Uman, Chortkiv, Chernobyl, and Rushin. Most of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, for the majority of traditional Hasidic Jews, were dominated were shaped in the context of these communities. At the same time, much of the late 19th and early 20th century was characterized by the conflict of Hasidism with the proponents of Jewish enlightenment, the Haskalah. Especially in Odessa, it came to be a key space for modernizing efforts of the Maskilim, not least in the field of modern Hebrew and literary Yiddish. Towards the end of the 19th century, traditional Jewish society was in a deep crisis on multiple fronts. Not only the economic and demographic crisis and the decline of the shtetl, relating to some of the factors that I've mentioned before, but Jewish society came increasingly under assault from the state and the non-Jewish surroundings. Towards the end of the 19th century, anti-Semitism came to play an ever-increasing role in the way people viewed their societies and how they interpreted the ills of those societies. With the emerging nationalist movements in the region, the question of who would be part of the nation had to be asked. And many, if by no means all, of these nationalist movements concluded that the Jews were not or could not be part of the nation they imagined. Or that indeed, many of those nationalists argued the Jews were responsible for the ills that had befallen the nation. To be sure, there were alternatives, but Jews were confronted with extremely hostile forces of a new form and a new quality. After the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, I mentioned him before, in 1881, violent pogroms against Jews swept Ukraine. Indeed, the term pogrom comes from Russian and it's first recorded in 1882, describing these particular attacks on Jews. Compared to later assaults, these pogroms had relatively few casualties. Around 100 in total is usually assumed by historians. But they marked a key break, a turning point in the relations between Jews and their surroundings. Most importantly, it forced Jews to seriously consider whether they would have a future in these lands. And if so, how this future could be secured and how it should look like. These trends would intensify, and the questions they raised would become ever more pressing. This was the case with the horrendous 1903 pogrom in Kishinev, and crucially with the revolution of 1905 and its aftermath. So briefly on 1905, because it's a really important moment here. Under the impression of Imperial Russia's defeat in the war against Japan, people throughout the empire rose up demanding an end to Tsarist autocracy and the democratization of the country. Especially the earliest phase of the revolution was characterized by remarkable unity of revolutionaries from a very, very broad spectrum of political backgrounds and belongings. Revolutionaries who fought for a new society, even though there wasn't much agreement over what this society would look like. Jewish socialists in particular stood on the barricades alongside their non-Jewish comrades. With the defeat of the revolution, however, came counter-revolution and came a reaction. In the imagination of the Russian radical right, Jews were identified with the revolution, and in turn, counter-revolution turned against the Jewish communities. What ensued was a wave of violence that swept through the Pale of Settlement in the Kingdom of Poland that cost thousands of lives. In many Jewish communities, Jewish socialists and revolutionaries in particular took up arms and defended their neighborhoods and towns by force. In these defensive efforts, however, they often found themselves alone. With very few exceptions, notable ones, but still very few exceptions, the non-Jewish socialists and revolutionaries, alongside whom Jewish revolutionaries had fought for the liberation of all the people of the empire, with whom they had previously fought and on whose solidarity they had hoped, would not involve themselves in the defense of the Jews. But the defeat of the revolution, the horrendous repression and the waves of anti-Semitism, as well as this disappointment in non-Jewish socialists and liberals, marked a key moment for Jewish politics. Zionism, which had previously mainly attracted small groups of intellectuals, could now make a much more convincing case for the creation of a Jewish national homeland and considerably gain in strength. Some socialists as well turned towards territorial solutions for the plight of the Jews. And even those who didn't, who insisted that the place for Jews to fight for their own liberation would be Europe, would be even Eastern Europe, even those insisted that within the broader revolutionary progressive movement, Jews should have their own space, Jews should fight for their own belonging, for their own, now, especially in Russian-ruled Ukraine, the position of those who had argued for integration into the state and who had professed hopes that in a gradual evolution of the empire towards liberalization and emancipation, they considerably lost ground. At the same time, however, new alliances were built, not least in the Habsburg Empire, where universal male suffrage had been introduced in 1907. It was the shared status of discriminated minorities in larger states that allowed for cooperation and mutual understanding of decidedly Jewish and Ukrainian movements and parties. Because both the liberal and the overwhelming non-Jewish socialist attitudes in much of the late 19th and early 20th centuries assumed that both Ukrainians and Jews would somehow assimilate, either to become Russians, and the derogatory term Little Russians for Ukrainians is illustrative of this, or to become Poles, or in East Galicia, that is. Both the languages were not taken seriously. Ukrainian was often seen as merely a Russian dialect, and Yiddish was perceived as a corrupted version of German. And these overlapping experiences created a space for those who insisted on the preservation of their languages and their cultures, nationalities, and identities. So in early 20th century Habsburg East Galicia, for example, Jewish and Ukrainian political parties closely cooperated in elections, endorsing their respective candidates, making sure that both Ukrainian and Jewish national parties, rather than Polish, would represent the mixed constituencies in the imperial parliament. And it is precisely this simultaneous remoteness and similarity in the face of seemingly greater forces, Poles and Russians, that made the Ukrainian lands a virtual laboratory for Jewish political representation and Jewish national autonomy once the imperial powers disintegrated and Ukrainian states were formed. Now, the idea of national personal autonomy, which most Jewish political movements in Ukraine in one way or another argued for, was an attempt to square the circle between nationalist aims and a multinational reality. A state like Ukraine, as it was envisioned at the time, consisted of many more national or ethnic groups than just a titular nationality. Olena spoke about this last week. Jewish activists at the time envisioned a future in which Ukraine would be the state of all nations living in it, where each national group would organize the matters they concerned that concerned it in particular by itself, such as education, culture, sometimes even the judiciary. Only shared policies such as foreign policy, for example, would be decided on by a common body, made by all national representatives of the various national groups in the country. Through such instruments of autonomy, those activists believed harmonious neighborly relations could be established amongst the citizens, and Jewish culture and society would flourish, unrestrained by the state and organized completely autonomously. This form of autonomy was implemented nowhere in full. However, the two Ukrainian states that emerged in 1918 came quite close to it. Both the Ukrainian National Republic, which was established in the territories of former Russian ruled Ukraine, and the West Ukrainian People's Republic, established in East Galicia in November of that year, recognized the Jews there as nations and promised full equality in at least some form of autonomy. The Central Rada in Kiev had a Minister of Jewish Affairs, and a portion of tax income was dedicated to Jewish educational and social institutions, and crucially administered autonomously by Jewish communities. In the Ukrainian state, in East Galicia, large-scale promises of Jewish autonomous self-organization were made, and while many Jewish parties hesitated to join the government, locally elected Jewish national councils for over half a year de facto governed Jewish communities and governed the Jewish population in all practical matters. All Jewish parties, from socialists to right-wingers, Zionists, and religious movements, supported these efforts. It must, however, be said that these ideas often remained lofty ideas. They were genuine, but limited to the small layer of political activists and leaders in the urban centers. The reality looked very differently once one left those centers. The war and civil war that raged in Ukraine until at least 1921 absolutely devastated Jewish communities. We only have estimates of the number of Jews killed. They range between 35,000 and 150,000. Most scholars assuming a death toll of around 100,000. All of the armies that took part in these wars over Ukraine participated in the slaughter of Jews. The statistics you can see here, based on numbers collected by Elias Cherikover, show that the majority of pogroms were perpetrated by troops loyal to the very government that had given so many freedoms to the Jews of Ukraine. The reasons for this are manifold. One being that the government was often incapable of asserting discipline in the army. Another being that differing social bases of the various movements, reflecting the tensions that existed in previous decades. For Jews, there were essentially two ways of responding to this violence. The first was the organization of armed self-defense. Throughout the country, or both countries actually, we can see Jewish militias defending their communities, sometimes in cooperation with other non-Jewish groups and sometimes completely independently. At the height, there were up to 15,000 Jews organized in militias, especially in central Ukraine. In many ways, this was the national autonomy mentioned earlier on a different level. The other and more common option was to join the Communist Red Army. While Red Army units, as you can see here, had perpetrated pogroms, especially in the earliest phase of the war, this largely stopped due to the pressure of Jewish communists within the Red Army and the Communist Party. Whatever Jews may have thought of the communists and the vision of the future, in most cases the reality was that the Red Army was the only factor that protected them from pogroms and guaranteed at least some form of security. Especially young Jews flocked to the Red Army, which even created some units where the language of command was Yiddish. In turn, however, this created deadly self-fulfilling prophecy. Many Ukrainians, but also Poles, Russians, Germans, Romanians, etc., of course, this was not a national phenomenon, saw their anti-Semitic delusion that Jews were supporters of or even behind communism confirmed. The violence that was directed against Jews was then often seen as being a violence against communists. A deadly anti-Semitic delusion which would return with horrific force a few decades later. Now, the establishment of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic and the communists' policies towards Ukraine and towards the Jews had highly ambiguous impacts were perceived very differently depending on one's standing and perspective. In 1920, about 2.7 million Jews lived in the Ukrainian SSR. In the early 20s, they were roughly 60% of the Soviet Union's Jewish population. With the removal of Tsarist anti-Jewish laws and restrictions, and with large-scale industrial developments in different parts of the Soviet Union, a large-scale process of migration ensued, from the small Ukrainian towns to the cities. But this migration was not only due to the new opportunities, but also due to pressure from above. While the economies and societies of the shtetl had been in crisis already before the war, and the devastations of the civil war had taken its horrible tolls. Where communities survived, they often felt unsafe with neighbors who had staged pogroms just a few years earlier. More importantly, however, Soviet economic policy, especially from the late 1920s and in the 1930s, had little use for many of the small-scale jobs of artisans, merchants, and so on, in which so many Jews had worked. Many lost everything and had to move to the cities to find employment in industry or in the public sector. The other factor that fundamentally transformed Jewish life was the wider policies of the Bolsheviks towards the Jews. Despite their earlier Marxist works having denied the Jews the status of a nation, the Bolsheviks' practical policies were proved to be quite flexible. While the recognition of Jews as a nation, with the recognition of Jews as a nation, the establishment of a Jewish People's Commissariat and ministry, alongside those of other nationalities, and the establishment of a Jewish section within the Communist Party, many concessions to Jewish autonomy were made, at least on paper. As for other nationalities, Olena spoke about this last week, the politics of Korenizacja meant that considerable space was given for Jewish cultural activities, as long as they remained in the framework that had been set by the party, national in form, socialist in content. In this context, Jewish secular literature, theater, and education flourished, especially in the major cities. Jewish socialists and communists in particular appropriated this space as best as possible. Indeed, for many, especially young and secular Jews, this communist project was a rather exciting offer. They could experiment with ideas and theories many of them had held for quite a long time, be it secular Yiddish education or the creation of Jewish agricultural settlements on the Crimean Peninsula. But despite this quite passionate involvement of many, especially young Jews, in these movements, Jewish membership in the Communist Party remained quite moderate, despite all anti-Semitic myths. The national composition of the Ukrainian Communist Party for 1926, for example, states that 43.9% of members were Ukrainian, 37.4% Russian, 11.2% Jews. For the Jewish community, this was just slightly above the share of the population. And if we remind ourselves that communism was a predominantly urban phenomenon and that Jews lived predominantly in urban centers, this number actually seems relatively low. But to be sure, the Jewish culture that was deemed legitimate by both these activists and by the party, and that was supported, had to be socialist. The implementation of the state's atheist policies, or anti-clerical campaigns, and secular education belonged to the painful experiences of many traditional Jewish communities. Despite the freedom of belief written in the constitution, synagogues were closed en masse, rabbis and communal leaders were arrested as alleged counter-revolutionaries. Hasidism essentially ceased to exist in Ukraine, aside from some small underground activities by Chabad. Whoever could went to exile. Of particular importance here is that many of these policies on the ground were implemented by young secular Jewish socialists. Often they returned to the shtetl of their youth and brought the revolution with them. So in many ways, it was not only the Jewish communities being confronted by the state, but also fighting an internal struggle over Jewish identity and the Jewish root. However, whatever freedoms had been there in the 1920s rather quickly disappeared in the 1930s. The Stalinist approach to Jewish cultural and education activists was one of absolute disdain. However socialist they may have been, they were accused of being nationalists or right-wingers of deviation. They were imprisoned en masse, and later many of them were executed. Stalinists employed anti-Semitism in many ways, often subtle, in the fight against oppositionists, real or imagined, branding them as foreign agents. Few communal relations already strained by violence and state atheism and transformation made it through this great terror intact. Not only because the number of victims, because of how they were chosen. And locals were commonly given a quota of alleged traitors from their own ranks, and they had to choose them themselves, which essentially broke communities. The Great Terror in Ukraine was, of course, preceded by the horrors of the state-inflicted famine from 1932 to 1933, which is commemorated as the Holocaust, and which cost the lives of millions of people in the Ukrainian SSR. The vast majority of them ethnic Ukrainians. I do not have the time to go into the details here, but it's important to note how this embittered large parts of the Ukrainian population against the communist regime, and for some, by no means all, this would later connect to the anti-Semitic myth of associating Jews with communism. Now, the often used term of the Great Patriotic War, used in Russia, obfuscates the fact, of course, that the Second World War, also for the Jews of our region, began in 1939 and not in 1941. It began with the German invasion of Poland, followed quickly by the Soviet occupation of much of Eastern Poland, including former East Galicia, today Western Ukraine. The experience of the population there in many respects resembled that of Ukrainians and Jews further to the east. The banning of all political parties, the non-conforming cultural and social organizations, the collectivization of the economy, the mass arrest and deportations of those suspected of opposing the regime, and often with their families. This was extremely brutal and met a local population that was thoroughly unprepared and to a large extent unwilling to participate. Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union in June 1941. In the first chaotic weeks of the invasion, many Jews managed to flee eastwards. At a later stage, there were even some evacuations. A considerable number of Ukraine's Jews, however, remained in the country where the German armies swept through. Kiev was already captured in September 1941. The German army was followed by two Einsatzgruppen units of about 1,500 men. Einsatzgruppe C was assigned to north and central Ukraine, Einsatzgruppe D the south, and later Crimea. The two units, with large-scale assistance by the regular units of the German Wehrmacht, police, and so on, worked their way through the country. Wherever they came, they rounded up Jews, Communist Party functionaries, and others, brought them to ravines, and shot them. In practice, most of the victims were Jewish. In the last 2 weeks of September, the Einsatzgruppen murdered 35,782 people, most of them Jews, in and around Mykolaiv and Cherson. The most horrific and most notorious site of the Holocaust by bullets, as it is termed, was, of course, in Babi Yar, just outside of Kiev. There, on only 2 days, 29th to 30th of September 1941, 33,771 Jews were murdered. The experience of Jews who lived in the regions annexed to the Soviet Union in 1939 from Poland was somewhat different. It resembled more the German policies towards the Jews in other parts of Poland, ghettoization and deportation to death camps. In Lviv, the ghetto was established in November 1941, which was followed by the Aktions deportations to the death camps of Belzec and the forced labor camp in Janovska, which itself became a death camp. Only 823 of the 120,000 Jews that had been forced into the Lviv ghetto survived. In the south of Ukraine, which was occupied by Romanian troops, collaborated with Germany, the policies were similar to those of the Einsatzgruppen, with mass murders ensuing, most horrifically, the massacre in Odessa. We cannot talk about the Holocaust in Ukraine without also speaking about local collaboration. This is true actually for every country. As in much of Eastern Europe, the Nazis' ability to identify Jews and therefore their selection for murder depended on local knowledge, on locals who would tell the Germans who was a Jew or who was a communist. The Germans made a concerted effort to recruit collaborators in the region. They found them amongst all national groups. The most considerable collaboration by numbers, however, was amongst Ukrainians, especially in the west of the country. When the Wehrmacht took Lviv in 1941, the Ukrainian nationalists, encouraged by the Germans, staged a series of pogroms during which an estimated 5,000 Jews were murdered. In their view, they took revenge for the suffering under communist rule, which, as I have previously mentioned, they associated with Jews, many of them. And while they claimed to take revenge, they attempted to establish an independent Ukrainian state and hoped for German support in this endeavor. While the Germans had little interest in Ukrainian national independence, they were happy to enlist Ukrainians in the fight against the Red Army and against the Jewish population. Estimates vary widely, but in the many different forms of collaboration with the Germans, ranging from local police to the SS Galicia division to the Travniki concentration camp guards, around 250,000 Ukrainians joined pro-German armed forces. They did so for many different reasons and with many different motivations. But all these motivations should not distract from the fact that what this collaboration meant, especially for the Jews of Ukraine. And it should also not, and I want to strongly emphasize this, it should also not distract from the fact that there were also Ukrainians who helped Jews to survive. Today, 2,673 Ukrainians are recognized by Yad Vashem as righteous amongst the nations. This is the fourth highest number of any country. And it is also necessary to put the relatively high number of those who collaborated in perspective. About 1,650,000 citizens of the Ukrainian SSR from all ethnic and national groups, but the majority of them, obviously ethnic Ukrainians, gave their lives as soldiers of the Red Army in the defeat of Nazi Germany and its allies. When in 1944, the Red Army reconquered Ukraine, between 1.2 and 1.6 million Jews had been murdered there. In Lviv, which before the war was the home of about 150,000 Jews, only 2,571 were still alive, most of whom had survived in illegality, some of them protected and hidden by local non-Jews. The post-war years in Ukraine were marked by violence and silence. In the west of the country, a nationalist insurrection continued for several years, with insurrectionists often turning against Jewish survivors. As throughout the Soviet Union, there was silence over the Jewish catastrophe. Especially during the anti-Semitic Stalinist campaigns of the late 1940s and early 1950s, publicly commemorating the unique Jewish suffering during the Holocaust was impossible. It took until 1976 that a memorial was erected at Babi Yar, which initially was only dedicated for the Soviet citizens that were murdered there, ignoring the unique Jewish tragedy. It took much longer and required considerable efforts until the commemoration of the Holocaust was possible in Ukraine. I'm already a bit over time, but if you would allow me a final comment. The current Russian regime claims that the invasion of Ukraine is to denazify the country, and it tries to employ historical memory, especially of the Second World War, to smear the Ukrainian people and state as Nazis. As historians, we have to do what we can to refute these misrepresentations and distortions of the past and their misuse for the crimes of the present. Foreign Ministers Lavrov.
Jan, you're disappearing.
Again?
Yes. Yeah. You.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm about to close, but I want to make just very briefly this this last observation. Take me a minute.
Yeah.
So I want to emphasize. So if anybody had ever any doubts about whether the Russian regime is sincere about this, and I expect nobody has, but the claim by Foreign Minister Lavrov just last week that the Jews themselves were the real anti-Semites and responsible for the Holocaust, I think speaks for itself in it how, yeah, I don't have words. We have to fight against these lies and distortions that are employed to legitimize a war of aggression and war crimes. But this should not mean, in my opinion, to whitewash any part of history, but to try to understand it in its complexity, to actively support the many Ukrainians, historians and local history initiatives to define in many cities and towns around the country that try to recover and document and commemorate Jewish history in their spaces. And crucially also to see how Ukraine has developed over especially the past decades and to see how remarkably it has changed. I apologize for the technical difficulties towards the end, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. So